If I heard that when I was a kid, I knew I was up really late.
Yeah.
And I was probably sick.
Yeah.
We're ready?
Yes.
Okay. Right, welcome to the work session for the Independent City Council and the Planning Commission. I want to thank the Planning Commission members that stayed late to meet with us. Thank you very much. I think it's to you, Fred. There's not much else I should say.
Perfect. So this is another one of those projects. It is a state funded project, but it's also a state mandate that we need to do. So one of the things, once we passed over 10,000 votes in the community, one of the things we had to do was a housing needs analysis. We also had to do a housing production strategy to essentially say how we plan to meet our needs and establish the identified needs from the housing needs analysis, and then what sort of methods we were planning on taking to achieve them. Part of the reason for this, I mean, is if we're not producing housing, the state now has a hammer to use on us. So that's part of the background of it. These are our consultants for the project at Cascadia Partners. We have worked with them on the housing needs analysis. We're working with them again on this. This is Ray and Jamin. We'll try and go through the material quick because we know it's late, but we do want to have a good conversation about it.
So to clarify, this is an information meeting. We're just getting informed. We're not making any.
That's exactly right, but at the same time, we would like your feedback specifically about some of the actions and potential ways that we could go on this plan. And they will talk about a number of those things in the PowerPoint.
Please.
And head up to the library. And if we could share the slide of these positions. Thank you. There we go. Good evening. Thanks for having us. Thank you for that introduction, Fred. I'm Ray Haggerty with Chain of Command, as Fred said. Here again, we were here in May and we're back for our second joint work session on the housing production strategy. So like Fred said, we're gonna sort of talk about some of the draft actions for potential inclusion in the housing production strategy and the HPS. But we want to spend the bulk of the time getting your feedback, having a discussion. And then we'll kind of wrap up with some updates on some public outreach that we're doing and will be doing, and some next steps for the project. Okay. So in May, you may remember, we sort of discussed the landscape of potential strategies for inclusion in the HPS. Today, we're going to kind of talk about a refined set of draft actions for consideration. And then we'll be back in November to meet with Planning Commission to review the draft report and then sort of have more discussion. And, you know, the draft actions you have in your document we provided, we're really aiming to kind of thread the needle between city goals, city concerns, feedback from the development community, right? So to kind of frame up the discussion, we wanted to share some kind of key themes to date that we're hearing. One is a need for smaller homes, right? Maybe cottage clusters, townhomes, homes that are affordable for first-time home buyers, more housing near transit, and more housing options for multi-generational households. We know that the city is interested in housing actions that really don't require establishing new revenue sources, right? Because we're thinking about housing actions that can spur housing development and housing productions, but that don't really require, for example, increasing property taxes or charging additional fees. We are hearing from the development community that code changes, support with infrastructure costs and land can help make housing development more feasible. But the big issue is that the costs of development are really high, right? And this includes system development charges. So some of these code changes and other strategies kind of help around the edges, right? But one of the big challenges are these high costs. And, this is kind of a tricky set of circumstances that we're working with, trying to find actions that are gonna be effective, while not permitting the city to sort of, actions that are beyond, its fiscal needs or sort of out of line with the vision for the character of the community. So I'm gonna talk through some of these draft actions. You'll sort of hear there's some redundancies between these actions, right? In terms of the outcomes they achieve and the types of housing that they support. And this is because, not all actions in the HPS may end up being implemented, right? If some actions turn out to not be feasible, that's okay. From the state's perspective, for the HPS, they want to see that you're taking action, as Fred said, to address housing needs. And if one isn't implemented, then the state will want to see the city sort of identify alternatives to address that housing need. So we're going to kind of talk through 4 different types of actions or policy levers: partnerships and communications, regulatory actions, incentive and investment actions, and actions related to land. So first up, our partnership actions. These are kind of focused on supporting developers and landowners by helping forge partnerships, provide information, kind of make more opportunities for housing development. We have 5 actions here. The first one is convening a housing working group, maybe to implement some of the actions in the HPS or actively kind of pursue opportunities for funding and sort of land to support housing development. The second is making it easier to build accessory dwelling units. This might involve kind of creating pre-approved plans that homeowners can use, that are kind of can move quickly through the permitting process, as well as providing other resources to assist homeowners with developing ADUs. The third is forging partnerships with land trusts that provide low-income housing and encouraging them to come to independence, right? The fourth one is connecting institutional landowners, maybe mission-driven organizations that have excess land with housing developers to develop housing on that land. And our fifth one is about supporting small developers, maybe providing assistance with finding sites, helping them understand land use and permitting processes, just bringing clarity and kind of certainty to housing development requirements. So our next set of actions revolve, around regulatory, right? This is related to your zoning code, development and design standards, and review processes. And, generally your code is pretty supportive of a variety of housing types. We have a long list of actions here, 13 regulatory actions. And that's primarily because the impact of kind of any one action is pretty limited, right? But together they really aim to kind of modernize the code, clarify the code, and reduce some barriers, and really create more opportunities for the development of needed housing. These probably look familiar. They were talked about a lot during the housing needs analysis process last year. So rather than go through them in detail, I'll just kind of say that they revolve around sort of a few different themes. One is expanding the capacity housing, right? There's some barriers in the code to high density housing, and reducing these barriers facilitates kind of the efficient development of land, which reduces the cost of development. Another theme is kind of encouraging a diversity of housing types, right, to meet a range of needs. Other themes on this sort of list here, streamlining review processes for development and encouraging low-income housing units or accessible housing units, including manufactured homes, some of these needed types of housing. So kind of in broad swaths, when taken together, these actions can really kind of drive down land costs, encourage this range of housing, and then needed housing types.
Can I ask a quick question on that? Yeah, I see in a lot of cities that they have these manufactured home parks, whatnot. Is it true that you can't finance a manufactured home? And if that's the case, I don't know how affordable that is for a lot of people.
Yeah, the manufactured home parks are kind of an important source of naturally occurring affordable housing. But because the land, the folks in the manufactured home parks don't own the land underneath, the land is really susceptible to being sold off and redeveloped. So it puts those residents in a kind of a vulnerable position. So what we're sort of looking at with this action here is sort of using zoning to create a preservation zone to kind of protect the manufactured home parks.
And aren't manufactured homes, when they're not on a foundation, those are financed and taxed as personal property, correct?
That's right. Yes.
The answer is yes, you can finance a manufactured home or car.
It's just not as real property.
It's just usually you have to have like 20% down at least. The interest rate tends to be higher. You have to have a specific lender, not all lenders do it. And then it depends on like the age of.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for those details there. So I'll keep us moving to our next section here, our incentive and investment actions. This is maybe our media section for tonight. These actions revolve around financial incentives for development or kind of direct investments, maybe in housing or in infrastructure. And we have 5 actions here. I'll talk through each one, and then I want to spend a little more time. I'm going to circle back to these top 2 highlighted in blue here. The first is thinking about urban renewal areas, right? Maybe expanding the riverfront urban renewal area or creating a new urban renewal area geared towards supporting housing. The second is property tax abatements, like a multi-unit tax exemption program, a MUFG program for certain housing types or housing in certain locations. The third is around scaling system development charges, right? Maybe evaluating the feasibility of revising the fee structure to be more on a sliding scale, depending on unit size. We know that smaller units are harder to finance and harder to build. So kind of looking at a way to scale system development charges while maintaining kind of revenue neutrality. The fourth is pursuing new state money, the revolving loan funds. That are now kind of available or soon to be available, excuse me, funds that cities can get to invest in housing. And this last one is around deferring system development charges, right? So delaying collection from before when construction starts to after construction. You know, we know these 2 kind of actions related to system development charges really aim at kind of softening the blow, right? We know that these fees are a big challenge and a big cost for developers. So that's the thinking behind these strategies here. So I want to kind of circle back to urban renewal areas, spend a moment talking about them, about URAs. These are, you know, I know we're probably all familiar with them, but it's late. We'll refresh our memories together here. They are state authorized development financing programs that use TIF to actually permit financing as the financing mechanism. And the goal of URAs is really to make investments that for private development that wouldn't otherwise occur, right? So adding to the tax base in the long term, in a way that wouldn't really happen otherwise. When TIF areas are created, revenue to pay for projects in the TIF area is generated kind of by the growth in assessed property value. This chart is kind of illustrating how this works, right? So when an urban renewal area is established, property tax revenue is frozen, that frozen base. And then investments are made in the district to catalyze new development and higher property values, right? Property values kind of starts to grow in a way that it wouldn't without these investments. That's that increment kind of piece of the chart there. And then ultimately kind of revenue is sort of reallocated back to taxing districts, right? It's shared back. The nice thing about TIF is it's not really a new property tax, right? It doesn't increase the tax rate. But taxing jurisdictions still can expect to receive more tax revenue than they would otherwise, right? So it's almost like a self-financing kind of mechanism, and that it leverages kind of future increases in tax revenue generated by rising property values. And the urban renewal funds, they're really flexible, right? They can be used to support housing development in a lot of different ways. For example, infrastructure projects, right? Allowing for kind of infrastructure to be upgraded in tandem with housing development. They can support land acquisition, direct project investments, or financial incentives. The city of Fairview, for example, has a program that uses urban renewable revenue to kind of essentially backfill system development charge reductions that they grant for certain types of housing in specific areas. So that's kind of one example of the ways that urban renewal can be kind of used. So, you know, you all have your riverfront urban renewal area, and that's been pretty successful in spurring development, right? Think about Independence Landing and Osprey Point. So what we'd be talking about for Independence with this action is, you know, really evaluating the feasibility of either expanding that urban renewal area, maybe forming a new one in a strategic location, to support projects that are kind of the most difficult to construct without financial support, right? Maybe that's income restricted affordable units, or accessible units that aren't tax exempt, right? And so this sort of implementation of this action would require kind of creating an urban renewal area. And the types of investments and programs that it supports, really depends on the location and sort of the priorities for that location. The city is permitted to establish just a little over 200 acres of additional urban renewal area. So including urban renewal in the housing production strategy would sort of signal to the state that the city is interested in more urban renewal area. And over time, could assess kind of feasibility and sort of choose how to use this tool to support housing development. One constraint I think worth mentioning is that it must be kind of approved by overlapping taxing districts in order to be implemented. So I'm gonna take us to talking about property tax abatement or MUFTE programs. MUFTE is a state-enabled program that allows cities to kind of incentivize really a range of needed housing, so long as it provides a public benefit, and this can be really broadly defined. But essentially, MUFTE allows for property tax exemptions for up to 10 years on the improvement value of property, not the land, but just the improvement value. So for independents, this action would include designing a MUFTE program. The city has a lot of discretion to really shape the program to meet needs and sort of your city's goals. Council sort of reviews tax exemption applications and approves each tax abatement. And the city can really set the criteria for which tax exemptions are eligible, including the locations, the public benefits, the application process, caps on the amount of tax exemption granted annually. And this could, replace the vertical housing tax zone that's currently in place. That would bring more flexibility to the types of projects and the types of housing and locations that are really eligible for tax exemption. But ultimately, the goal is sort of over time bring this net positive impact to the tax base. Constraints, again, it must be approved by a majority of taxing districts, not all, but a majority. And of course, new programs require staff administration to set them up and keep them going.
Are those normally transferable, like if the property sold?
I believe so.
Yeah.
I believe it would run with the land. Yeah,
Stays with the property.
yeah,
We can double check that.
yeah.
It probably will jump forward really fast on the Sunday.
The Russians are hacking.
Are you able to manually advance the line? Okay, so where's my? There we go. I'll try it again after this slide and let you know how it goes. So we're at our last kind of policy lever category related to land disposition and acquisition. There we go. All right, so cities can play a pretty unique role in unlocking land for housing development. So we've laid these actions out in more of this kind of step-by-step process that sort of go towards ways the city can be sort of more proactive in these land-based actions. First is maintaining an inventory of land that's underutilized and has the potential to be used for housing development. Number two is assessing development readiness, right? How these inventory parcels are suited for development, how ready they are for housing development to happen. Number three is assisting development partners, maybe nonprofit developers, land trusts with pre-development, right? Whether that's transferring ownership of land division, zone changes, right? Steps like that happen before housing development occurs. The fourth is sort of aligning capital investments with this inventory of sites, right? Prioritizing infrastructure improvements for sites that are kind of suitable and sort of geared towards housing development. The fifth and sixth steps, formalizing agreements with public agencies for the acquisition of, surplus or foreclosed on land, so that the land can be used for housing. And the last one, land banking, so acquiring sites and then holding onto them for future housing development. The city is already doing these first 4 steps. Part of our sort of draft actions is recommending that this process be formalized and repeated regularly. So I want to spend a moment kind of looking at steps 5 and step 6, right? Step 5 would look like the city kind of formalizing a land disposition process with other public agencies and institutions, really to grant the city first right of refusal on surplus land. Formalizing this process with right of first refusal would bring certainty to the city's ability to kind of acquire surplus land and sort of influence how that land is used. This last number 6 is the land banking step, right, where the city looks for opportunities to acquire sites and that are ideal for housing development, right? Steps 1 through 5 kind of facilitate that process there. And then when funding is available, the city could acquire land and hold on to it until there's a development partner ready to build housing on that land. This action is of course contingent on the source of funding to acquire land. A new or expanded urban renewal area could be used to fund land banking and within its boundaries. And with land banking, the partnerships and the way the land disposition happens, this can look a lot of different ways. I think with several of these strategies, land banking included, there's really room to shape kind of how they're implemented and approached, right, within the housing production strategy. So I'm gonna kind of move us on. We did some impact modeling or financial modeling to kind of take a closer look at development feasibility, and sort of looked at how housing actions kind of influence that. I want to leave lots of time for discussion, so we can sort of revisit these slides if we have questions about development feasibility, but I think for the sake of time, I want to keep us going to our questions. And Mayor McArdle, I thought I would maybe talk through the discussion questions we have and turn it over to you to facilitate. We can either go question by question or.
This group is not shy.
Fair enough, okay. Our sort of main questions for you all to sort of guide this discussion are, if you have any clarifying questions for us about any of the actions. If there are any actions, that you want more information about, right, before considering them for the housing production strategy. If any of these actions raise concerns, right, that you want to sort of talk about tonight, or if any of them seem very high priority for implementation.
Well, I just have a question about step 5 for surplus, like intergovernmental agreements to provide surplus for property. How much is there? Which is there? What's the outcome of that? What's that look like in terms of moving the needle? Because that's going to be I feel like that's going to be the headline. But that doesn't seem like in terms of cities, costs and things like that. But what's that actually like? How much what does it even look like in terms of acres and whatever else? Like, do we go out? There's no inventory, obviously, because it's not a formalized process, but it just seems. Do you have a sense? We have a sense that, obviously, from Fred, the city itself doesn't have a surplus public property that only want to and don't have a use intended for it. But part of the idea behind that is that the county may have it sometime in the future, a property, that they intended for another use that they decided to have anything in particular that identified. Okay. Another thing is when property goes tax delinquent and then it's auctioned off, that is sometimes in a case where a city can acquire a property and the city has an agreement with the county that they would have first right of refusal to try to acquire those properties that are foreclosed on. That is another source of what I was saying.
So where does the resource come to purchase that property that's because I have about 5 questions related to that. So let's talk about where the resources come from.
So one new revenue source that we've identified for that would be a new urban renewal area or district. That's really the one right now that if we're not talking new revenue sources, there is a way to raise new revenue specifically for affordable housing, which is a construction excise tax. Based on the direction you gave us at the last meeting, we decided not to include that as a recommendation, given where the city had just updated their system development charges, didn't feel like it was appropriate or right timing to consider additional tax and funding development. With that context, then we decided to look at
urban renewal is probably the most likely source for some kind of land acquisition for affordable housing.
Following up on your construction excise tax, the school district's already doing one. If we ever did something like that, would that be over and above what the school districts are? So that's a secondary, would be a secondary construction excise?
I assume so. It's a separate authorization from the state for cities to adopt that specifically for affordable housing, so.
I don't.
Okay. I'll wait for my other questions later. Sure. Other people, go ahead. Please. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Oh, whoever wants to be next.
Oh, thank you. So I guess my question is, it'd be nice to have data about how successful the things we're currently doing, how successful it is or not. So when I see the mention of the vertical housing tax credit that we have, how successful is that?
It's not successful, I can say that, right?
So I guess that's my
Not
point.
utilized.
It has not been utilized. We have maybe one project that could utilize it at this.
And so I guess my question is, it'd be nice to get inventory about what, like, I love that we're trying things. But it's like, what's working well, what's not, so that we can reshuffle the deck, because I think people. You know, coming from the Salem area before I moved here, people in Salem always talk about urban renewal as this evil thing. I think part of it is because they don't understand it. But the other part of it is because there's never a relook and say like, how successful is it? There's not a public conversation about it. So it'd be really helpful, I think, for me, I can only speak for me, to just look at the data of like, this one works great and we should really lean to this. This one's silly and isn't helping anything, right? Especially if we're gonna have to use capital to convince our partners in the community to also opt into this, our tax partners. It'd just be nice to have the data to know where to ask and where not to.
Sir. Go
So
ahead.
mine was, I mean, it's very similar to what he said, except we already have a urban renewal district. Do we have the data on, has it been successful? Has it paid for itself? What does that look like before we decide we're going to build another urban renewal district? So
So
that,
our URA, we put a significant amount of money into the URA in order to build infrastructure. So we have a lot of debt in the URA. So the URA is paying back and it's paying the debt. But it's not putting anything into the gym.
right, and so that would be my concern, because we have this track record, that this is what we've done. We have to be very careful if we're going to do a new district in the future, because they're scary to hear about urban renewal, even if, you know, what people feel about, because they are very expensive. They don't always pay for themselves, and they can cripple small business, local people, you know, people long established, people who have been in the community. So we have to use extreme caution when we go forward with something like that, because our track record hasn't been very successful.
I will say, Councilor, they will eventually pay for themselves. Once we get the debt paid off. And so we can't end the URA until the debt is paid off. When the debt is paid off, then, you know, the sun will rise and everything will be beautiful.
It would be nice if maybe return on investment could happen in our lifetime.
2034, I think, that's it. And then,
That's so old, but.
and then Fred and I were also talking. And Fred and I were also talking, there's the potential to use a grant to fund the infrastructure for the URA. So we would be funding it from city coffers. But there could be a grant that we could use for the infrastructure, that would help to create the opportunity for that. So that's.
And that's why we're doing the housing project, because they need to see a plan that might, because that's how you get the funding, is to have the plan.
Correct.
You have the vision, plan, and then you can ask somebody to support it, because that was one of the questions I was having about, you know, the state loan fund.
Ask a question. Go ahead. I was gonna ask if it's funded, how big of a pot of money, what's that process look like?
Yeah, it's going to be available starting, I think, in the end of June 2025. So details are still being worked out. It's $74 million at the state level. cities have to kind of apply to be eligible for that and then bring the project forward to receive those funds, and then cities actually grant those funds to a housing project. The eligibility criteria as it currently stands is pretty flexible in terms of the types of housing, right, that it can support.
And remind me which agencies.
It's the Oregon Housing and Community Services, OHC.
It's a loan versus a grant?
Yeah,
It's a loan, it's so the city repays the loan with property tax increases. Jamin, feel free to jump in if I'm not explaining this correctly, but it's a loan, it's a grant from the city to the development, yes.
We do property tax increases over and above what we do. I mean, we need every penny we collect.
I think it's sort of more similar to urban renewal.
Yeah.
So it's a fee whether.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yes,
it's like growth and property taxes that would be catalyzed by the project being
Yes.
like project being built over that time, a short time frame, 5 or 10 years, would then go to, go back to repay the revolving loan fund or recapitalize the revolving fund over time. So it's not an increase in the property tax rate, it's allocating the property taxes for that specific project for a small factor.
Okay.
It's about
74 million,
Small short you are. Okay.
74 million for 241 cities, and we're the 55th largest city. Wonder how much Metro will be. Go ahead, Councilor Martin.
My question is more from the consumer level. I know that ADUs are allowable in many different properties in the city, as well as there's going to be allowable with the new state legislature laws, mix of residential, homeowned and rental both. But as a consumer, if I wanted to build an ADU in my yard, where would I go to find out what the restrictions are, what the costs are, what the space requirement is, what parking is all about, and all of those things that you would need to create a space that.
Because then you would dial, on vote 3.
Well, part of the idea of the partnerships strategy was, let's put all those resources in one place and make it easier for homeowners, because homeowners aren't developers, right? They don't know what
Yeah.
else is going to do or the,
Yeah,
And-
and I mean, Monmouth has actually done that. Monmouth has prepared I think they must have had a similar strategy coming out of their housing production strategy. So I've seen their little cheat sheet. Hey, you wanna do an ADU? Here's what to.
And that should be something that I think there eventually is going to be a lot of interest in that. It's like having a private tiny home. And I think that we should provide something in the way of a public informational session or online or a combination of all those things. So that if we get asked about that we have a chance to, an opportunity to refer.
Maybe Emmanuel could do a video.
Pardon me?
Emmanuel could do a video.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I just want a real quick question. Are we paying interest only on the urban renewal debt or do we pay principal on all those debt?
The URA was paid, well, it was, most of the debt is to the city. So it is
Putting it back in
to the
general.
city. Well, there's some bonds, some to water, some to sewer, not very much. Generally,
Okay, but all the principal is being paid.
I think so, but let me check. Okay.
Okay, my other question, I've done this question several times. How many homes do we have to build?
20 homes.
Like, what's the deficit?
Like what, well, I know the whole state was like 3,600.
36,000.
36,000. What is Independence? Do we have a responsibility for a number, or do we just have to show that we're moving forward and?
yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
So we're in compliance as long as we do these meetings and.
yeah, I would think about like compliance in this framework of planning for housing and more of the state wants to see evidence that you're taking action and doing something different than you've done in the past. And you're doing that in a way that you're addressing a whole variety of housing needs. So maybe you're not just building single family homes, or not even just building multifamily higher density. You're doing different kinds of strategies that help to address a lot of different needs. And if you can make a case to the state that you are doing that, I think that's the sort of threshold.
So we don't have to actually build them, we just have to say that we're encouraging different types of housing.
Yes, yeah, you need to report on, say what action you're taking and what actions you didn't take. If you didn't take something, you need to discuss what the alternative action is.
You would eventually have to report numbers though.
That we do.
Yeah, eventually.
And would, for
I mean,
instance,
I think we're reporting numbers right now. They're gonna look at numbers based on what I've heard. And I mean, it seems to me that underproduction is one of the things that is gonna be a red flag.
Yeah, so you're referring to the new rules which are being developed now, which may modify some of the subs. We're a bit on shifting sands right now. We need to produce a housing production strategy and show how you're addressing prevailing needs. There may be more strict rules to report on your housing production. If city, if not enough housing is being produced in the city based on the target, then some other actions may
So
come.
we will get a target at some point.
Potentially, but those rules are in development. And not mine. That's why
and I know this is probably asking ahead, but like the project that's going on in the Opera House right now to build second-story residential downtown. Will those numbers count into our total? Good.
Yeah, that was my question, because I mean, we have a population growth projection of over 16,000 by 2050. Is the state gonna require us to say, this is how many units we need to produce in order to meet that projection growth?
I don't know about the new rules, today, so when we did that housing needs analysis last year, we projected 20 years out to 2040. We were back to 2042. And, the estimate was a need for about 1,300 units between now and then for a population growth of about 7,500 people. And so, or not, sorry, 2300. Yes, yeah. And so, that's your target right now. Again, that could change in the future if the state changes the rules, but right now we're working on those set of rules. And so what our task for you to do is just to put together this housing production strategy and demonstrate how it's going to make progress towards those 2,300 units over the next 8 years. So, and for units of different types and income levels.
It's not 23 over 8 years, it's 23 over
Over 20.
23.
Okay, so you're kind of setting the number for us. Right, by
Well,
your
housing.
strategy,
The housing needs analysis does it for us. We get the
Oh.
numbers from
That's what we
Portland State
Yeah.
University.
Yeah,
Um,
the planning commission saw some, they presented.
Yeah, there is a process now to state kind of like process to do a housing projection. What the state is considering is revising that, and it might go into the future, but as of,
Oh, so right now we do have the number.
you do have a projection.
Okay, what is that? What is
That's
that?
2,300 units.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
But it could change.
It could change, that's okay, but they
it's
gave us a
pretty-
target.
Yeah,
Yeah.
They give us something. Okay, thank you.
So I have a couple of other questions and I'm trying to do questions and, okay. How do we assure that, okay, we're trying to build affordable housing? How, developers are in the business of making money. That's the only reason they're here. They keep telling us that the SDCs are gonna stop them, and we've had, what, 3 or 4 more subdivisions coming in ever since we raised the SDCs, that
Gerald says we're looking at plans now, so.
plants, okay, so how do we make sure that, okay, we're trying to do things to lower the costs to get in? So how do we make sure that those savings are passed on to homeowners, to potential homeowners?
I'd say any of the ideas we have for incentives, so a tax abatement program, for example, or something funded by an urban renewal. Our assumption is based on the direction you provided us before, is that we would document that in the housing production strategy as the developer would need to commit to an affordability restriction on the units in order to receive that incentive, right? So that's
Can you put that into a little bit more, give me an example, that would be helpful for me.
yeah, so like, let's say a multifamily developer, a private market for-profit developer comes in and they want to access a property tax abatement program you have in place. You might have a requirement that says 10% of the units need to be affordable, or 20% of the units need to be affordable at 80% of area median income. developer say, okay, I can make that work, that's worth the property tax abatement for me. Those units then would play, or the property then would have a deed restriction on it that said 20% of the units must maintain to be affordable over time. And so those units must be occupied by households making less than 80% of their median income, and the rent must be set at a level where they can afford that. That deed restriction runs with the property, usually for, could vary from 30 to 50 years, something like that. And the city would have some role in that, so they will, in enforcing that.
So that would be for primary for rentals.
Could be for affordable or for homeownership too. It gets a little bit more complicated for homeownership, but there are models to do that.
Then other questions, I'll come back to some of mine a little later. Go ahead, Counselor.
Isn't it possible, and I don't know how to do this, but wouldn't it be possible, instead of having a developer develop an entire subdivision? So when I built my house, I bought a lot, I hired my builder, I did the whole process, I thought it was fairly expensive. Can't we make some sort of incentive for, a private person to buy a single lot and build the home that they want instead of pushing out this constant development scheme? I know it would be a lot easier for an entire development to be done, but maybe we could be more cost effective if we did look at, maybe smaller.
That's, and I'll just, it's a nice idea. We just don't have enough lots
Right.
to do that. Like, so like Brandy Meadows, like, people bought a lot, there's like 3 or 4 builders out there. They bought those lots as soon as they were created. And then they individually developed on each of them. It wasn't Dalkey developed it, I mean, he developed a couple of lots, but we had like 4 builders out there doing different houses. We have people who will look for infill lots to do exactly like what you're.
But I did,
Yeah, exactly what you're talking about. And like, anytime there's an infill lot up for sale, people will call.
I was just wondering if
but
there's
we-
some way we can
we-
increase that amount, because I totally agree with you, there's not a lot of infill. It's entirely reliant on somebody wanting to do that. That's a lot to take on for an individual too.
Oh.
I mean, we can't force people to do it.
I could not imagine in a subdivision, a bunch of different people with all their different contractors and the different subcontractors and their different deliveries and the chaos.
Right.
And
And
I think it's a good idea, but I do.
I think it makes sense.
It's.
From what you're talking about, it's a lot, so. rather than big
Right.
lots.
Like, especially because we have. and Might be controversial, but I'm saying, we have some properties that are dilapidated beyond repair. It could be different, so. So that would be, that could be a source of.
Of incentivizing sales to people to rebuild and to redo.
But isn't that what's already happening with infill lots? I mean, are developers buying infill lots or individuals buying infill lots?
It's kind of a mix of both. I would say a lot of small developers go into those lots. So, I mean, I get a lot of calls, houses for sale. Hey, can I tear that down? Put the duplex or whatever. it may be.
And what is your answer?
Of course.
Well, I mean, it depends on where it is.
It depends on that. We allow a duplex on every lot, some for a single family. So you could pretty much do a duplex on every lot, some for a single family. People know that in people are doing the same thing in Salem. So I'll get calls about infill lots. And they're like, hey, can I put a quadplex on that thing or 40 units, because that's the allowance in Salem, and it's like, no, and they allow it.
But we still have historic requirements that.
Absolutely, yeah, they just don't apply to all neighborhoods.
So I question historic preservation conditions as well. I mean, we have some properties that have huge backyards. It's like, wow, they're being underutilized and the people can have a mechanism to subdivide it.
The entire sort of thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I just connected.
I think it's important to promote green space. I really.
So I want to bring up, go ahead.
Oh, just to draw this up, I want to connect it, there are some of the zoning actions in there, regulatory changes that those are probably the most effective policy change the city could make to try to support infill development. Because it's really expensive to redevelop existing properties and houses, especially bigger houses actually, which is saying it's more complicated sometimes than greenfield development, and so. Mainly I think that probably the way that gets done is by removing some barriers to doing different kinds of projects, more units on the lot, that's what's probably gonna make more people interested in that. And the numbers would pencil out to do that. So a lot of those actions we're looking at are, okay, can we tweak some things here to make it a little bit easier to build, let's say, a cottage cluster, right? Or maybe instead of just doing a duplex, you could do a quadplex or four townhomes on this lot. Those kinds of things would then maybe turn the needle to where it's feasible.
I mean, I'm just gonna jump in. One thing that I think is really interesting, if you look at a lot of communities. And you'll see the older homes sort of transformed into a few different apartments, right? Well, shoot, Independence used to have that. In fact, right over here, there's a vacant lot, right behind where Brad's building over here. That thing used to be an apartment home. It looked just like a single family home. Was that? Yeah, well, that's exactly what I'm saying, is that the precedent is not without precedent here in this
But we
community.
used to have 50,000 people come into Harvest House.
So another place too that had it is the house that's for sale on Monmouth right now. That's for the very pretty one.
Oh,
I was-
Connie Hewlett's old house?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I was reading the historic little thing for that home and it said it used to be apartments. That is-
Yeah, my house was at one point.
So,
They broke it up in the sixties and fortunately.
But you should go in that house and have a whole tour and invite us, because supposedly there's a secret laboratory.
So I have a couple of things. There was conversations about SDCs. And SDCs are how we pay for everything. And then was suggesting that we reduce those. Become apoplectic. But one of the things that the discussion was delaying SDCs. And I've heard this from the developers for years to, until occupancy. Well, the downside of that is, and I've seen cities get saddled with this, is that, things get built, okay? People want us to put in so. Those kinds of things. But if we don't get paid up front. And then, so sometimes developers stop partway, or run out of money, the economy takes a burp. And then all of a sudden, your city is gonna be stuck with paying for infrastructure and there's no money to pay for it.
Yeah.
So I'm just bringing that up when folks talk about delaying SDCs, all that is helping make the developer, is lowering the developer's risk, but it doesn't do anything for us. It just puts us at risk. And a lot of the private sectors likes to do that. Well, let's pass off the risk to somebody else, because they don't understand how cities are put together. You wanted input? Yeah, I just got a dose.
Well, okay,
Excuse me,
We do, in a sense, kind of do that, because we allow financing of SDCs. And so they can finance their SDCs and pay a small amount over time. But then we have that notice. So we're not at risk. So we're trying to do that, the financing, as opposed to just delaying their payment. We're allowing a small payment over time until they
I
settle.
feel a whole lot more comfortable doing that than what what we've had to sit through
Far more
developers.
traditional with benefit to the city.
Excuse my intensity.
oh, it's fine.
I wanted to.
Yeah, and I wanted to clarify on the idea of SDC scaling that we talked about. The idea is not reducing the revenue you would generate from the SDCs, but sort of scaling
Right.
these more proportionately so that the smaller units.
Wasn't giving you grumpiness on that.
Okay, yeah, so I just want to clarify, because, yeah, we understand, you just went through the process, you adopted a lot of facility plans, you figured out how much you need to charge your SDCs to pay your infrastructure, you can't just go back on that, right? And so what we're trying to do is find ways to soften the effect of it, and yes, the deferring does have some risk to it, and so that's downside to consider.
I want to get back to the vacant apartments out of homes, because I think that's a great idea, but it's a very old timey kind of, idea. How do we prevent people from turning those old homes into Airbnbs?
We haven't talked about Airbnbs as part of this at all, and I mean, that's an interesting conversation. Currently, we don't have restrictions on short-term rentals right now. And so I don't know the degree that that's,
We're not like the coast.
Well, and not just that, but you know, if you drive up Monmouth and you see all these homes that are businesses, you see them in Salem on Liberty, I mean, almost every home on Liberty is a business. That's taking away a home from the family. You know, is there anything we can do to convince people to, you know, I mean, I realize commercial real estate probably comes at a premium, but still, they're taking a home and a yard and, you know, space from the family. What can we do?
But they're creating a job,
Huh?
creating a job.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess
The example we have is our neighborhoods, we have a house that's empty. I don't, more often than it's occupied, and so I do have some concerns about the short-term rentals and what we can do to incentivize people to. To not just be using it as a way to sit on property. So that, and I think there's different categories, there's like you have an owner occupied primary house within PU that they are a VRBO or. I think that is a different category than somebody that's taking up the primary residence. I don't think we should get involved with it. People do for private properties.
Well, I know that's the law, but still, properties that we can use for Airbnbs and we're, you know, we don't have places for families and people rent homes. Do we know to the extent that's happening in Independence? So, yeah. I mean, I see it all the time. There's a home right across from McDonald's. Then like, I think the parents died or whatever, and kids took it over and now it's an Airbnb.
Karen has all the rental because we have to get a, what do you call it, a license?
Well, if they do, I mean.
Yeah, if they do.
Oh,
To pay the lodging.
The lodging.
Pay the lodging, yeah.
so
I
Fred,
don't know what the numbers are. Maybe it's not a big
Yeah.
amount. Big amount.
Fred, I have a question.
Yeah.
We just passed, some ordinances allowing developers, like, was it 10 exemptions?
right,
How does that interface with this? And,
He's been eavesdropping on our planning commission meeting.
oh, no, I actually, I haven't, but I'm worried about how that interface happens
right.
and how, what the unintended consequence, how does that fit together and how might people twist and maneuver it to do what we don't necessarily love? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think the answer is, I don't know at this point.
Oh, it's easy. It's an honest answer.
SB 1537.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say, you know, some of the standards that we're sort of recommending taking a look at, you might want to change this to reduce the barrier. That barrier could be effectively lessened already because there's a state adjustments process. So as we looked at it, most of those that we recommended, sort of the difference between where the standard is and where we think it could be up or down is probably more than the adjustment would get you. So with most of those, we think this is probably moving in the right direction, but I think what we could do in the report, because you're gonna go through a process to implement these code changes, would be just to memorialize. This should be considered in light of the state adjustments process, right? That already provides some relief to some of these development standards. And maybe some of them, you don't need to change as much as you think you do, because there's already gonna be requests to increase or decrease that standard. Does that make sense?
Intellectually, at one level it does, but on a nuts and bolts level, we don't have to do it tonight, but I'd be real interested to see some examples of where that interface happens and how it's taken care of or not, or at least outline where the problem might be.
Yeah,
And
yeah, we can compare them, go on site to site, I think it makes sense. Then we can see
Yeah.
how, what you could get from the 1537 adjustment versus what is being proposed in the plan.
A lot of cities are doing that right now. It's basically, you're gonna change your standard, but then the state's gonna allow another 5% or 10% or 20% beyond where you changed it to. So it is fun.
Yeah, I want to make sure they don't, that, again, some developers or people who don't live here, they're willing to do things that they wouldn't want done in their own neighborhoods. And so,
That's where Shane comes in there.
I can tell you,
We're talking about private markets.
Yeah.
That government has some say, but they're private markets and the marketplace dictates that. So in small towns, public shame is a powerful force in the
Gary Paceberry used that, or I can tell you I can tell you a whole story, but that's after. Are there other questions? Some of us are talking a lot. Okay, did you folks get some information that you needed?
I think what would be helpful is the two sort of major, the more significant sort of, and complex things that we brought up in here, urban renewal, and property tax abatements. So at this stage, I think it would be helpful for us to know temperature check. Do you want us to move forward, including those as a concept in your housing production strategy? You're gonna have that come back to you for formal adoption later this year. Or are those ideas not, there's too much uncertainty about how this would be implemented, what the impact would be at this stage to include them? That would be helpful for us to know. We can dig in a little more and paint a little more picture of what that might look like to have a new urban renewal area, what the steps would be. We can go into it a little bit more in depth. If you're not sure that you would like to sort of signal a commitment to that in your HPS, then I think we would want to spend our time elsewhere.
Do you folks, let me just ask, and do you folks want to have another one of these where we utilize, I'm recognizing the challenge that where we utilize a little bit more on this? I don't know, I'm asking. What do folks think?
Can we get some data? Right, just data on what's working well, what's not working well, I think it feels like maybe I just don't understand how it works, but it feels like a kind of a parish request of like, if we're talking about creating a new urban renewal, what's going well, and what's not, understanding that previous city administrations might have made decisions that have impacted current city administrations. We could still use the data to say this is working, this is not working.
So you are in particular, Commissioner?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think we probably helped put some of that together. You were right.
I guess, myself personally, like, I mean, the concept of URA. I'm not opposed to it, but if we were gonna do it right now, not necessarily palatable.
Yeah.
And I think, so just even in light of just like putting it in a plan to get the state off your back, I mean, sure, doesn't commit us to anything necessarily. And it's sort of like pretty half-hearted in some ways, but for like a 10-year look, 15-year look, 2034 look.
Yeah, the HPS, the things in there, if it's an action, it should be completed in some way in 8 years. But that completion may be evaluating the feasibility of.
Yeah, I think evaluating the feasibility of URA in 8
You
years.
go through that process and say, we intersect, it's
So
not
that's a
feasible,
good way to put it.
taxing districts don't support it, or
Yeah.
there's not the conditions for it to be a large pool of URA. There's lots of reasons why the city don't establish URAs after they look at it.
Yeah.
And I think moving forward, in the next step, whatever form it takes, we need to be very conscious of how we educate the public about this. Because some of these things are gonna have very individual, impact. Especially if somebody wants to do an ADU, or if they want to remodel their house into separate residences or something, and we need to be able to provide a good path forward for that.
The information, can you give like what the new starts have been over the last maybe couple of years or something? If like maybe square footage or if they're
Yeah.
multi-family or.
Yeah, I know that we had all of that data, well, at the H&A, we definitely looked at it, but I don't know how easy it is to pull the more recent stuff. But we can definitely pull that and start look at that as well.
Well, and I think it's important that the public knows that we passed a milestone with population, and it put us into a new array of not only laws and regulations, but possibilities. And so things like, I talk to people often and they want to know what's happening downtown and what are they doing with the top of those buildings. There's not a concept that there's second story residential right downtown. And it is just something that's new and we need to focus on some education and connecting people and opportunities, and I'm done now.
So I'm trying, because I'm recognizing the lateness of the hour. So would people object to letting folks work on what we've talked about, maybe grabbing some data and then getting together again as a group and talking about this and, yeah, because this is a big deal.
Let's do it before the council meeting now instead of after.
Yes,
Yes.
please.
But-
It's part of it is length, so the issue that we deal with length is if we have it at 5:30, then we're going into your council.
Then we
meeting.
got until 6:30.
Yes.
6:15.
Okay, so let me see, can people how many people in here could not do a 5 o'clock? Is there anybody who couldn't do a 5 o'clock?
You mean on a Tuesday?
If you have
Or-
if you have a like transporter where I can get from my state job to here, because I
Just
can't.
tell them you're
No, I
calling.
just, I don't stay caught.
Go ahead.
I don't know if I see utility necessarily do one on this floor. In terms of, I mean, it's it's not, to me, I guess it's pretty it's a half-hearted commitment to a plan that we just put forward in front of the state. So it doesn't say necessarily change the mechanisms. Like, how many other financing mechanisms do we have instead of putting in like the state's gonna pay for it as like a third, like people do this. Like, that's not gonna happen necessarily. And so it's hard to, I mean, maybe I'm just thinking.
No, I'm opening it to the group to what people think.
Well, it's much work as you guys have put in, and I know we all appreciate it. You know, I kind of agree that if we had, sorry, the kids are probably. If it's kind of half-hearted or we have a way out potentially, then maybe we should look at something like that so that we're not creating our data into something. You know, so. Sorry.
Other opinions?
We're gonna do our best.
Yeah, we're gonna do our
Right,
best.
that, we're gonna do our best.
I mean, that seems like to be like the actual nature of this whole
Yeah.
plan, right?
Especially if they're changing things. you know.
Yeah.
Right,
And
Yeah, it's inevitable, it will change.
yeah, because we're on sifting stands. That's what he said. And I'm-
But I
And the
mean, we're
legis-
locked in for 8 years if we get this done, right?
Yeah.
We're not locked in, but we're good to go.
We're good to go.
That's, I'm seeing it.
Language friend.
And then there is a way out though, so if we say we're gonna try really hard, and then they come back and say, hey, you're not doing this, then we say, oh, sorry, we tried.
Really
We're
hard.
gonna try something different now. I mean.
We're gonna do a lot better than some other cities. I know,
Yeah.
some cities are clueless. I mean,
And we'll do stuff. I mean, we don't need that.
okay, so what I'm hearing is that we're just gonna wait till they come back with, is it the final report?
No, so they are scoped for one more meeting, so they would, so in their scope of work, so they're more than happy to come to another one of these. If the council doesn't want to participate, planning commission, you're gonna participate.
Amen.
So, do people, I'm trying to get a sense here, I'm not trying to run a railroad.
Council, are you interested in another meeting?
I think a lot.
What do you wanna do, Marilyn? You
I
want
would
another
like
meeting?
to have
I'm
the,
gonna play.
at least a look at the data collection that they're.
Kate, what do you wanna do?
I think another look.
Sarah, what do you wanna do?
Well, I think that if we could get some more information, the data beforehand, and then maybe schedule a scheduled meeting tonight. Yeah.
Right, again,
Sometime in the future.
John,
I of course want to be
January.
involved in whatever process.
okay.
All right, we're gonna have another joint meeting, and the mayor's bringing cookies.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody object? All right, go home and do whatever you do at home.
Hey, so planning commission, when is the good, is the best next meeting, that's the regularly scheduled meeting?
Didn't you say we're not gonna have one?
We're not gonna have a forum next week, so then I was trying to push for the 23rd, but I don't think Alex or Sally can be there, and I think Courtney's still in. So, Does that mean that we're just essentially pushing it to the next regularly scheduled meeting? Is that?
You could have a conversation meeting.
We can't meet on this,
No,
there's no.
no, there's no.
Okay, we'll pick another day. We'll be on a different.
Any kind of.